Okay, so I'll just introduce myself a little more. My name is Neelu Varghese. I'm a Vista who works in the Office of Service Learning and Undergraduate Research here at UAV. I graduated from UAV in May of 2020, and before that, was majoring in neuroscience, and I did research in the lab of Dr. Rosalinda Roberts, studying copper transporters and schizophrenia. So if you guys have any questions, feel free. And if you have any questions during the presentations, just stop me. Just unmute yourself and just like, hey, I got something to say. Oh, one other thing, this presentation is actually from Dr. Melissa Lavanti. And if you guys are interested in seeing her presentation, we actually have it on our YouTube page. So a little more information if you need it. And Gareth, you can go to the next page. So just to start off, why don't you guys tell me a little bit about what you think it means to publish? Why do you think we should like publish at all? I mean, it's a lot of work, so.
Share information that can help like advance your field.
Yeah, that's a good reason. What else?
Spreading knowledge.
Yeah, that's a good reason. So I think we can move to the next part. Gareth, could you, thank you. So of course, what you guys said, sharing results, building upon knowledge, establishing a reputation currency for career advancement. These are some of the reasons, although there are many, many more reasons to publish your research. For example, when we say sharing your results, we're not just talking about sharing it with researchers, sharing it with the general public and giving them a chance to like look at what's being done. They may be able to apply it in a way that we might not think about, or like it might help someone in a way that we did not initially identify. And then of course, building upon knowledge, showing this research to other researchers in our field can help them expand upon what we've done and check what we've done too. So that's another good way. Another thing is that it establishes a reputation. If people see that you've done research and that you've written all these great papers, they get an idea of what kind of researcher you are, and they have more trust in what you're doing. And this can of course help you with like publishing papers in the future as well. And then finally, it's a currency for career advancement. So for example, if you plan on doing research in the long term and people see, oh, she's published like 3 papers, she knows what she's doing, then of course they're going to be like, I think I like her. I think she knows what she's doing. She could be useful. Like people have a good idea of you. So of course, these are some of the reasons for publishing research, but there are many more. Oh, yeah. So here I'm going to give you an overview of like what we're going to be going over in this presentation. And it's basically after you've decided to publish, what are you going to do? Well, first of all, you're going to decide where to publish your paper. Right now, you may not know which journal to publish it in, but like think about the journals that you're interested in. So what journals are there in your field? What journals do you usually go to when trying to figure out something for your own research? Those are likely the journals you're going to go to publish your own research as well. Next, you're going to think about what to include and what to exclude. We're going to talk a little bit about this later. Next, how to format and submit your paper. So depending on the journal that you plan to submit your paper to, they may have different requirements for formatting and submitting. So for example, some papers may be like, you can only limit your paper to 2,000 characters. If you turn in a 10,000 character paper, they're probably not even going to look at it. You didn't follow the requirement. They're not going to be interested in looking into it. So that's definitely something you have to be careful of. Next, we're going to talk a little bit more about the peer review process. And then finally, finally, we're going to talk a little more about revision and resubmission. So first of all, when you're choosing a journal, you have to look at the scope and criteria. When we're talking about scope, we're talking about what type of research you're looking into. For example, if you're going to try and publish in the Journal of Neuroscience, you're probably going to need neuroscience research. And if you're trying to publish in something like PLOS Genetics, they're looking for research on model organisms like mice, fleas, zebrafish, stuff like that. And they want to know something about biological processes that are going on. They even give you specific examples. So oftentimes when a journal is talking about their scope, they'll tell you what they're doing in general or what they're looking for in general, and then they may give you specific topics. So here, PLOS Genetics is telling you that they're also looking for topics inside gene discovery and function, gene expression, complex traits, stuff like that. So if you're worried about, does my research fit into that? That might help you a little more. And then second, they're looking for criteria. Criteria, they're basically just saying, are you doing good research? Are you being a good researcher? Originality, high importance to the research in the field, rigorous methodology, substantial evidence for its conclusions. Those are things that you need in good research. For here, they also talk about broad interest to researchers in genetics and genomics, and that's a specific thing that PLOS Genetics focuses on. So you also should consider that when publishing your research. And when you're looking for things like scope and criteria, you can do two things. You can literally go on Google and be like scope and then type in your journal. It can be as simple as that. You could also go on the About Us page for each journal. So they say About Us and they might give you a little bit more information about what their scope is. They may also have a specific tab talking about their scope. So these are all different ways that you can look into what the scope is. And again, if you feel like you don't know what journal you want to look into, there are a lot of people in your lab who probably had to look into similar research, and they might be able to give you an idea. Okay, yeah. So the next thing you need to look into is the journal's impact factor. The impact factor is basically what's the average number of times an article is cited from a certain journal. So for example, if you're thinking about really big journals, they're probably going to have a high impact factor. Hey, Gareth, could you go? Thank you. Historically, a high impact factor usually means that the journal is more important. And this could include journals like Cell and Nature. So like things you've probably heard about before. Whereas actually we're having something happen now where people aren't looking as much at the impact factor. And the reason for that is their articles published in Nature and Cell, papers published in Nature and Cell, they're probably things that like many different fields and many different groups can read about. But when the studies become more specific, there are probably only a specific group of researchers who are looking into that topic. And when it's only that specific group, it's probably not going to have a high impact factor. Like if you're going to publish a study on like a very specific part of the mechanism of diabetes, it's not likely that like people studying like every part of the human body is going to look at that one research. It's probably only going to be looked into by a handful of researchers. So now people are also looking at the reputation of smaller journals. So Gareth, thank you. So like, even if a journal has a lower impact factor, it may still be pretty good. For example, the Journal of Immunology is pretty well respected. It has a good reputation, but its impact factor is like 5. Whereas Nature and Cell, their impact factor is like 35. So like, there's a huge difference there, but they're both like well respected. So next, you also need to decide what kind of journal you need to publish in, whether it's open access or a traditional model. One second. I've been talking a lot. If you're doing a traditional model, this would basically be the journals where you go online and you look for an article and they're like, we'll let you read this article, you just have to pay $30. That would be the traditional model. What they're basically doing is they're having readers pay for the publication cost of the journal. But there's a new model, which is the open access model. In this model, the research is publicly available. So it's publicly available and free for everyone to use. But the cost is on the research team. So there are good and bad sides to both of this. For example, with the open access model, you kind of get an idea like why people want it, because a lot of research nowadays is funded by the government, and that means taxpayer money. So like if it's funded by taxpayers, then it sounds like it should be free. But again, this increases the cost on researchers, and this may make it a lot harder for them to publish their research. So if you're thinking about publishing your paper inside an open access journal, that's something you need to consider. Can your lab afford to publish it in an open access journal? But like the good thing about open access journals is that they tend to have a higher readership and citation rate because more people have access to it. So more people can look at it, more people can be like, oh, I understand this study, I want to learn more about it, stuff like that. Again, we talked a little bit about this in a previous presentation where we talked about how you can get to different papers. So the thing about open access journals that you guys should think about if you're ever planning on publishing in them is that you need to watch out for predatory journals. So if a journal ever contacts you and is like, we really like your research, we want to publish you, be careful. They could be a predatory journal. And what predatory journals basically do is that they'll say that they'll publish your research, they'll take your money, but then they won't publish your research. What they may also do is that they may take your data, so they get your data, and then they sell your data to another researcher or another research group. And then that research group can use your data to publish their results, which again, stealing data. And then finally, overall, this can tarnish your reputation. So if people see that you're working with predatory journals, they may think, oh, your data is not trustworthy, or your data is not, something that they want to look into. And that can also be problematic. So something that previously happened, oh, sorry, could you go back? Something that previously happened is that I think in the early 2000s, there was a librarian at the University of Colorado who he wanted to create a list of predatory journals. And he basically organized like a list of journals that had practices that were like somewhat untrustworthy, or like it was pretty sketchy. And so they created a list called the Beals list after the person who made the list. He put it on his blog, and it was free and publicly available. And it basically gave a list of potential predatory journals and publishers. But the problem is they ended up facing a lawsuit because some of the papers on there weren't predatory. They just kind of seemed that way. So because of that, they ended up having to take down the list in 2017. However, if you go online, you'll probably find a list of like similar kind of lists online. Could you go to the next slide? One more. Could you press next one more time? Thank you. So one more time. I'm so sorry. So if you guys do get an email for something that you think is a predatory journal, then there are a few, I'm going to give you like 6 tips to just like check just to see if they are or are not predatory journals. So first, you can review the website. If you look at the website and there's grammar mistakes and frequent spelling mistakes, then they probably didn't put a lot of effort on their website. They're probably not a trustworthy journal. That's a good way to figure out that they're a predatory journal. And it's pretty simple too. All you have to do is just like be a grammar Nazi. Next, you can confirm the membership in like reputable organizations. So there are like reputable open journal organizations such as like, I have a list. Sorry, let me find that list. Just had it with me. Yeah, they have a list such as like Directory of Open Access Journals, the Committee on Publication Ethics, Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association, stuff like that. Basically, these are groups that look into each journal and they're like, oh, you're doing everything right, you're doing everything fair, you have good practices, and we accept you in our organization. So if a journal says they're in that organization, then you can check with the organization to see if the journal is in fact part of the organization. And that's a good way to figure out if they're a predatory journal. Another thing you can do is check their contact information. What predatory journals often do is that they say that they're from one country when they're from another. So if you look at their contact information and the area code is wrong, then that's a good hint that it's probably not trustworthy. Also look at the time when they email you. If they email you at a time that their country of origin isn't in working hours, it's probably not a trustworthy journal either. But again, these are just multiple things you can look into. And then finally, you can look into the editorial board. So look them up in things like LinkedIn or other stuff like that, where you can get an idea of what their professional background is, just to make sure that they're trustworthy. And then finally, look over their peer review process. Sometimes you may be looking for a journal that has a quick peer review process, and that can be beneficial, but make sure that even though the process is quick, that they're not like removing a lot of important factors. So just look over their peer review process. And then finally, read over their past issues. If you look over their past issues and think that it's a pretty good journal, then it's probably pretty trustworthy. So finally, what to include or exclude. So this depends on whatever journal you plan to publish in, but this is for PLOS Genetics that we just showed before. They have a pretty like set idea of what they're looking for. They want a title, they want the authors, they want affiliation. So like what university are they associated with, or what group are they associated with? They want an abstract, which you guys probably know is like just a short description of like what research you're doing, and then an author summary. An author summary is basically like a shorter version of the abstract, but this isn't something that they commonly ask for in journals, so that's not something you have to worry about too much. Finally, they ask you for an introduction, results, discussion, materials and methods. And this section is important particularly because people are going to look at this section to repeat your results. So like, can this be repeatable? So that's pretty important. Finally, acknowledgements, references, and supporting information and captions. The supporting information and captions would be just like supplemental data or like supplemental graphs and stuff like that that you want to include. And then how to format and submit your publication. So this is an example from Nature, and they have very specific examples. They're basically saying the page limit, it needs to be under 5 pages. The word limit needs to be no more than 2,500 words. Their figure limits, they can't have more than 4 figures, and their reference limits can't be more than 50 references. And some journals have these really specific requirements, but yeah. And so again, keep this in mind when you're writing your paper. If you end up having your paper rejected over something like this, it can be really disappointing. So always keep this in mind. Another thing is that recently some journals are doing format-free submission, which is basically like you can submit your journal in whatever way you want, but after your paper is either rejected or accepted, after your paper is accepted, they'll basically go through it with you so that it fits the style or fits the format that the journal is looking for, which I like a lot better. Yeah, thank you. So next, the process of peer review. So from this point where it's basically first the author is going to submit their paper to a journal. And if the journal deems that all the requirements have been met, then they'll send this to the editor. And the editor will basically first decide, does this fit the scope of our journal? So does this look into all the like same topics that we're interested in? And if they reject it, then they go to the author and be like, sorry, this doesn't fit what we're looking for. But if they accept it, then they're going to start sending it to other peer reviewers. And this is basically means people with similar competencies. So for example, if you're doing research on, well, if you're doing research on a gene that's associated with schizophrenia, they're going to send this paper to researchers who study schizophrenia or study that specific gene. And they're basically going to look over it. These reviewers would then look over that, and they would then make comments, or they would basically say, here are comments that we think that should be made, or things that we think should be looked into, or we think this paper should be rejected. So after the peer reviewers look over this, they're going to send it to the editor and decide what to do next. And again, that's basically reject, revise, or accept. I mean, sometimes they do accept papers, but it's not very common that they immediately peer reviewers see this and they're like, yes, you should accept this. That doesn't happen very often. But after the editor decides what the next step is, then they send it back to you. And they basically tell you what revisions you need to make. So these could be minor revisions or major revisions. So major revisions would be things like, yeah, we think you need to conduct a few more experiments. We think you need to do a little more. Whereas minor revisions, they would be things like, we think conducting a few more analyses would be good. We think you should talk a little bit more about a certain topic, or this doesn't make as much sense, stuff like that. Small changes that they want you to make. Sorry. And then once you look into this and respond to this, then you'll send it back to the editor, and they'll send it back to the reviewers. The process will happen again. And then again, they'll decide, do they reject, accept, or does there need to be further revisions? And they'll just keep doing that. Sometimes when editors choose to like reject a paper, they'll tell you, okay, this is why we rejected. But sometimes they'll just reject your paper. So maybe peer reviewers thought this paper needed a lot of work, and therefore that's why they wanted this to be rejected. And maybe sometimes they're like, oh, this is completely wrong, we don't agree with any of it. But a journal might just send it back to you and be like, rejected. So then you're gonna be in a place with your lab to have to decide, okay, should we keep going with this? Should we stop this? What should we do? So you're gonna be faced with those kind of hurdles as well, just to keep that in mind. Oh, you can go to the next. Thank you. So when you're tackling publication revisions, the first thing you should do is read the comments and then walk away. The reason I'm saying this is because like most of us don't like having like, oh, you did this wrong, you need to change this, you need to do this, you need to do that, especially on a paper we worked really hard for. So it's likely that right after reading these comments, you might be a little emotional about it. So read the comments and then walk away and give yourself some time to digest what they've said and calm down a little, or set your emotions aside for a little while. Then check how long you have for revisions. So sometimes revisions they only give you 2 months for a revision. So if it's a minor revision, they may only give you 2 months. But if it's something major, they may give you 3 months or 6 months. So if they end up asking for experiments, you can actually determine whether or not this should be done. For example, you can determine the feasibility of the experiment. Like, for example, if the research you sent in was on, you did it with a cell model, but they sent it back and they're like, we want to see this in a mouse model. You can say, this is not something that's typically done in our lab and that we have the ability to do, and therefore we cannot. You can comment back that. But again, this varies. Another thing you need to do is you need to determine the timeline. So if you need to do an experiment, how long do you think the experiment's going to take? Is it going to take 6 months, 8 months? Is it going to take a whole year? And after you determine the timeline, you might need to ask for more time. So if you end up 3 days before you need to send in your revisions and you realize you're going to need at least another 2 months, it's highly unlikely that you can contact the editor and be like, I need another 2 months, and they'll agree. However, if you early on contact them and be like, I need some more time, there's a little more work I need to do and I don't think I'm able to complete it on time, then that might be more reasonable. So finally, if they ask for more writing, then there are different types. So first they can ask for clarification. And this is usually pretty helpful because it might be a certain topic that might be a little confusing, or it could have been worded better or something like that. Another thing that they may ask for is to, have more writing so that you strengthen a certain argument. This is also helpful. So if you face these two, 100%, you should most likely do it. They'll probably help your paper no matter what. However, if you get a comment back from the reviewers that's completely off topic, then you can politely decline. For example, if a reviewer sent you back a comment and they were like, I think my paper would really be a good thing to include in this part of your paper. I think a study I've done would be a good thing to include in this part of your paper. If a reviewer says that, or a reviewer wants you to include something they've done, and it seems really off topic, you can talk with your PI and just find a way to politely decline. Again, I'll just talk about that later. Again, be respectful and be professional. Even if something they say may be frustrating, you have to remember to be respectful and professional. And if you ever get comments that are like really unprofessional or really derogatory, you need to contact the editor immediately. If the editor doesn't know that their reviewers are making these like awful comments or acting inappropriately, then they may like continue to use these reviewers, not realizing that there's a problem. So as soon as you tell them, they may be able to act on it. Again, you can talk with your supervisor to see if there's anything else, but overall, remember, if you feel like there's something that a reviewer said that seems really off, then make sure you tell your supervisor or the editor of the journal. And then finally, include a cover letter. So the cover letter is basically where you're going to be like talking to the reviewers and like stating, why you made certain changes, what changes you made, stuff like that. And one way you can do it is you can go through each comment one by one. So you can like basically list all the comments they've made and go through them one by one. These have to be concise and specific. So you can't just be like, in figure 1, I made I changed the graph to a different model. You can't just be like that. You have to like specifically say, I repeated the analysis and this is what I found, and here are the changes that were made in these areas or in these fields. That's what I noticed the changes, stuff like that. And also remember, throughout this, you have to be respectful. But yeah. One other thing, revisions may not just happen once or twice. You may have to go over them frequently, and sometimes you may have to go to like different journals. So for example, with me, when I was working in my lab and I got my paper published with my grad student, we initially sent it to one journal where it was rejected. And then we had to send it to another journal, and then we had to go through a round of revisions. Overall, this process took over a year. And during that time, my grad student had already graduated from a graduate program and gone to a postdoctoral fellowship. And I had graduated college and I was already out. So during this time, we had to have a lot of communication with each other. We had to have communication with the other members of the lab. So when you're working on a paper, remember that no matter what happens, you have to keep in contact with those you're working on this research with. So after all the revisions were made, at least with our paper, my grad student sent it to everybody in our lab and had all of us look through it and just give the okay to her. That's also a good practice to do. So finally, when you finally get your paper published, celebrate. Take a breath and celebrate. It's a long process, it's a hard process, and there's a lot you have to do. So it's definitely, you deserve that breather. And then a few other points you should have. If you want to share your research, that's completely acceptable. Like you can share a free PDF copy of your paper, but you probably shouldn't put it on like a secondary website. So if you need to look into the journal that you published in and see that they're okay with it. So if you want to put your paper up on ResearchGate or on a blog or a personal website, you need to make sure that the journal that you published in says that that's acceptable. They may not like that. They may be okay with that, but that's something you need to look into so that you won't have any problems in the future. And then finally, do you guys have any questions? Well,
I'm just going to the chat to double check if there were any questions. But I do want to say thank you, Neelu. That was very informative and really some great information. I was just gonna ask you a question for your perspective from as a being on an editorial board for as an undergraduate journal. Are there any pieces of advice specifically for undergraduate journals that you would give?
For undergraduate journals or people publishing in them?
To people publishing. So these students, if they were looking to publish into a undergraduate journal, or as opposed to Nature or Science, but if they were trying to get published just in an undergraduate journal, what was your perspective from that?
I think a good thing to keep in mind is to keep in contact with the editor. So there may be a lot going on, especially when it's an undergraduate research journal, and a lot of people involved are students. So it's a good idea to keep in contact with the editor and make sure that you know what state your paper is in.
Excellent. I see a few people are putting there, again, just a reminder, if you didn't put your name and your email and your program, make sure to put that in the chat so that we get that to your programmers. And just a reminder also, these undergraduate journals, I talked about it last week, but again, just like the expo is an opportunity for you to practice presenting your research, something like Inquiro that we have here at UAB or other types of undergraduate journals are a great way to practice this process of going through a peer review and revisions and all of those sorts of things. So I think it's really good to also look at those, and maybe some of your home schools have that as an option. But again, we do have that here at UAB. You can look at an example of that on the Inquiro website, which is a nice one. I think Neelu's got some stuff on there. Maybe also that's a leadership opportunity. We're going to be talking about leadership and ethics here in a few weeks. But I think it's also really interesting to think about that as an opportunity to be on an actual editorial board for an undergraduate journal. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what that meant to you in your career.
I mean, for me, it did two things. One, it kind of showed me about like all the research happening around UAB. It was like when you start getting all these papers on all these different topics, you get to kind of see what's going on. So that was it kind of like made me a little excited. It's probably the best way to put it. I was really excited hearing all the stuff that was going on. Another thing it does is it kind of shows you just how difficult it is both for the journals and for the researchers, because we like undergraduate research journals probably don't have as many opportunities to like have the papers revised. So likely we may just like have to reject journals that can't be like frequently revised. And it's also difficult to like get researchers to, agree to revise these papers, but the ones who do, they're really interested in it. So like when we finally get those few papers that are really good, we're just like super excited about it. it's definitely a hard process though. Like even at just the undergraduate level, there's a lot you need to look into. And there may be like researchers may not agree with the findings just because like maybe their own studies are like opposing it, like they're looking into fields or researches that are different. So that's also something you probably need to keep in mind, not just for like undergraduate journals, but like for journals in general.
No, and I was going to say one kind of anecdotal story. I was going to say, I know one of the biggest challenges when you're on one of those editorial boards is to find faculty and researchers to serve as peer reviewers. And as frustrating as that was, you had to exhibit a lot of professionalism. And that helped you, I think, in that process later, because then you know you got to have patience and perseverance and you know, creativity sometimes with how you communicate with faculty who are, you know, very busy at times, who have agreed to be, you know, peer reviewers for those undergraduate journals. And I imagine the same process when you get to the next level, that, you know, patience and perseverance and good communication is a huge part of that process. So whatever side of the journal you're on, I think those are great skills to develop.
Definitely. I mean, overall, I think that if you're ever planning on publishing in a journal and you're connected with the editor, keep in contact with the editor, like have a relatively okay relationship with them. Don't like send a really rude email because like you still haven't gotten your paper back after like almost a month. Be professional because like it's going to be frustrating.
Definitely. All right. Any questions from the still fairly large crowd here? I know many of you are obviously you're here for a short amount of time here at UAB, and you've got projects that you're working on that you're going to present that necessarily won't go to publication, but it's still really good to be thinking about this. Maybe when you get back to your home school or, you know, those types of things, you know, those conversations are important to have with your mentors and people in your lab. And networking. And I will say, you know, I go to a lot of presentations from the medical school here at UAB, and I know probably a good percentage of you are interested in medical school. And they say about 5% of undergraduate students end up being published as undergraduates. And very often that being on your application can be a real, you know, big highlight, especially if you can talk about it. That's another thing. I mean, if you're the 8th author and you just did a little tiny part of it, that's different than being like first author or second author or something like that. So just like I talk to students about finding a good research experience where you get really deep research and you can really be articulate about how important it was to you for your career advancement and your decisions. I think the same thing is true with journal articles. Rather than just trying to rack up journals, it's really important to, you know, go to solid ones and have it be a really good publication that you can talk about, because you may get that question in that interview process, and it's good to be able to talk about and how it connects to what you want to accomplish. So
Yeah, I mean, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I mean, for me, when I was interviewing for medical schools, when I was preparing for like questions associated with my research, I would always think about like, what specifically did I do? What did the research mean to me? What did it do for the overall? Like, what did it mean relative to the overall? And what was the experience overall for me? Like, what did it teach me? What did it mean for me? Stuff like that. Thinking about it, it's like it actually gets a lot harder because like the questions they may ask may not be like limited to things that you know. So like you're only going to imagine them asking questions about like your field or like people from like other people in your lab who like studied similar things. If you get a question from somebody who hasn't heard about this field, then there's a lot of like specifics that you're going to have to remember.
Excellent advice. And just as a preview, we will have a preparing for grad school workshop during Expo Week that you can attend. And we're also going to have a career panel where we're going to have postdocs and recent graduates from UAB talk about their careers. So these are additional things that you can ask those folks. So anything else, Neelu?
I think that's all I have.
All right. Well, again, I want to thank you. That was very informative, great information. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for being here today. Again, make sure your name's in the chat so we can let your supervisors know or your programmers know you're here. But other than that, have a wonderful day. And thanks again to Neelu.